All right, it seems that we are live. I'll wait for 1 second for a confirmation from my colleagues that the audio, video, everything works as it should. And in the meantime, those of you who are already in the room, why don't you type into the chat box where you are dialing in from, so we get a good idea of the geographic diversity of those who are interested in transport policy. So that speaks to your mobility and speaks to your interest in this wonderful topic. A lot of you are from Brussels. Wonderful. We have someone from Cyprus, from London, from Italy, from England, various places. That's excellent. And thank you so much for spending your lunch break with us, if that's the time zone you are in. And I'll try to make it as useful and practical as possible to cover everything related to this wonderful competition, which is fairly one of its kind. I don't recall such topic, such a competition that has taken place for a good while. So it is a great opportunity. And as we will see, there are quite many places on the reserve list, and it's under the so-called new EPSO system that I'm going to discuss more in detail. So with that, as always, please put your questions into the chat box. My colleagues who are in the background will be helping you with all technical questions and things that they themselves can directly answer. Whatever they may not be able to answer or something that requires my input, they'll feed that to me. So I'll stop from time to time to ask or to answer your questions that I'll be getting. If there's not enough time for something to be covered, or I might not know the answer right away, we'll follow it up in due course in a day or two, perhaps by Monday, to make sure that no question is left unanswered. So I think with that, let's cover this wonderful topic of AD7 transport EPSO exams. And this recording and the slides will be shared with you afterwards, so you're definitely going to have access to it. So I won't bore you with my background. You might know some of the work that I do, and I'm with EU training for many, many years now with a wonderful team in Budapest and in other parts of the world. And we are trying to help you pass the competitions. And our company, we have a great community of former candidates, current candidates, future candidates, who knows. And on Facebook, on various social networks, we are trying to pay more attention to LinkedIn. So please follow our page and get in touch. We're absolutely happy to hear from you and share information there. We have test packages, a great number of them, and webinars with lots of great participants. But without going more into detail on what we do, which is something you might already be familiar with, let's actually look at the new selection system, and more specifically, the current AD7 transport competition. I say new selection system because there has been a change, somewhat a reform of the EPSO, the European Personnel Selection Office exams and the selection procedure this summer. So since summer 2023, we have a fairly changed system. And I say change that because those of you who may be around the EU circles, EU bubble, EU affairs would know the previous system, which has slightly changed this summer. So there's no more assessment center. And then basically you have a 5-step system. You might put that into a different frame, whether it's 5 or 3 or 6. But basically, the building blocks are the ones that you see on screen. So there's an application, you need to upload supporting documents. Then there is a remotely proctored 1-day test, and it's not a full day, obviously, but it happens on the same day for everyone. And then there is an eligibility check, and ultimately you're on the reserve list. So the idea was to streamline the process and make sure that they can conclude the competitions in a much shorter time frame than they used to. It's no longer a year or a year and a half. The idea is to have anything between 4 to 6 months, and then it's all done. So it's much more interesting for candidates and for high flyers like yourselves who want to pass an AD7 competition, that you will not need to wait for such a long time to pass these tests. One interesting aspect, at least at the time of recording and in this particular competition, is that you can pass the entire exam without saying a word. So that's a pretty interesting thing. Well, you actually do need to say some words when you are doing the audio validation or the check at the remotely proctored test, but you can mumble anything. But save for that technical check, there's no oral exam in this selection procedure. Where you do need to present yourself and use your oral communication skills is really after the selection procedure at the recruitment stage. So once you're on the reserve list and you're looking for a specific job, that is when you will be subjected to an interview and perhaps some other, I wouldn't call these tests, but other conversations or other ways of evaluating your suitability for a particular position. But for the purposes of the selection procedure, everything is basically through computers and in writing, and we will discuss what exactly that means. But then again, these are written tests by and large. So with that, let's look at the competition. The 410 is the reference number. What it actually means, there are 80 positions on the reserve list, as all of you would most likely know, because this is widely publicized and communicated in the notice of competition. And mentioning the notice of competition reminds me to give my usual disclaimer that whatever I tell you is absolutely to the best of our knowledge and to best of our understanding of the process and all the other documentation that's been put out there. But the true and real source of authority and the source of information is really the notice of competition and whatever EPSO communicates to you through your account and through their official channels. Now, these 80 places, that's a pretty good number, considering that it's a specialist competition, considering that this is for a quite targeted kind of positions and kind of work. Where that will be? Well, most likely it's going to be in DG Move, so the European Commission's Directorate General for Mobility and Transport. And it's not exclusively a DG Move, but by and large, they are going to be the biggest client of this particular competition. So legally speaking, you might be recruited in the end somewhere else, so perhaps still inside the commission, but in a different Directorate General, or even, again, legally speaking, it's possible to be on a reservist and then be hired by other institutions. But the way the institutions work, and especially when it comes to the selection procedures, is that it's essentially the commission that is the biggest client of this competition. So other institutions are not going to poach candidate against the will of the commission, or most particularly DG Move. So bottom line is the vast majority of those on the reserve list will end up working there, and that typically means Brussels, but it doesn't mean that exclusively and everyone will end up working there. Now, what will you do? Well, certainly you are going to do work and work on things that EU officials work on, right? Like that's a pretty tautological explanation. But in more practical terms, that basically means that you'll be dealing with, say, coordination, negotiation, representation at international level. So if the EU and most notably the European Commission negotiates on behalf of the EU with the International Air Transport Agency, I think that's IATA, for instance, or they negotiate some shipping agreement, or they negotiate with UN bodies, well, that's going to be the kind of job that transport experts and transport policy experts will be needed. And you might be dealing with budgetary or financial aspects of transport-related projects. So whether that's innovation in aviation, is it about airport slots, is it about the financial aspects of making European transport greener and how that ties into the railway networks? All of that will be part of the broader package that DG Move covers, and you will allegedly be dealing with at the time of the recruitment. Now, to have this kind of targeted experts and specialists, there are quite a few conditions that determine whether or not you're eligible. Now, this is the first time that EPSO has actually introduced a certain tool. I'm going to say a few words about that, where you can self-check whether you are eligible. But then again, it's a self-check tool aided by an algorithm, but it's by no means an exclusive thing. It's not going to validate your profile at the point of the application. So I'll come back to it in a few seconds, but just to see that there are always broad, general conditions of eligibility, and then there are specific, unique to your profile and to your background. So what are those general ones? Pretty classic. You need to be an EU citizen, one of the 27 member states. You need to have fulfilled military service, if that is a compulsory requirement based on the country of your passport, your citizenship, right? Let's say I'm a Hungarian Belgian citizen, and if that were a compulsory thing in my, let's say, legal situation, then I need to prove that I have fulfilled that. And that's typically, I think in Greece, perhaps in Austria, if I'm not mistaken, and some other countries. But then again, it's something you will likely be familiar with. And then last but not least, you need to meet the character requirements for the job. That often refers to the, how should I put this, security clearance, for instance. So if you are involved in negotiations which are highly sensitive, and by and large, most negotiations tend to be like that, but it's even more sensitive than others because it's about military issues or military logistics, you may be required to have a clearance, and if that causes trouble, then it might cause trouble for your recruitment. Right, so having said that, these are the general and pretty basic criteria for you to be eligible for this competition. What are the specific ones? Now, the specific ones, it's essentially about languages and qualifications. So qualification and work experience, I mean, I would put that in one package. What it means in practice. So the language part and all of this is then basically checked by this wonderful new tool called EASY. It's probably some play on words, which is the what is it called? Experience Assessment Survey Instrument. I need to memorize that abbreviation. That could be subject to some multiple choice quiz. But on a more serious note, this is a little tool, basically like a survey tool that you fill out, and then it gives you a score in the end that informs you how likely or not likely you are to be qualified for this particular competition. And again, it's not going to exclude you from applying. This is just to inform you whether you meet the formal criteria. And presumably this is how EPSO tries to minimize the number of those candidates who go through the entire process only to find out in the end that they are not actually eligible. So what it does, everybody's encouraged to fill this out. One thing, as we were playing around with it, we noticed that, for instance, if you put your knowledge of languages in the end, it asks you your language 1, language 2. If both you put there, say, English, it's not going to show you that, hey, that's not good. Hey, that you are not eligible because you need to specify 2 separate languages. So these are minor things, but then again, it doesn't seem to be a dynamic tool in that sense, but it's still a questionnaire and it helps you determine whether you are eligible or not. Now, having said that, let's take a look at the language rules before we look at the qualifications and the work experience. So here's one with the language rule, pretty straightforward. You essentially need to know 2 languages. So a thorough knowledge of EU languages and a good command of another EU language, which presumably for most, if not all of you listening to this and the vast majority of candidates would not be a problem. The language 1 could be any of the 24. So you really can pick any of the EU's official languages, regardless of what's your country of your passport, your citizenship, or what's your country of origin for that matter. So if you happen to be a Finnish citizen, you can still choose Czech as your language 1. It really doesn't matter as long as you pick a language in which you can pass the different stages of the competition. And then the other language, again, can be any other, with the caveat, one of them must be English, right? So with my previous example, and just to be sure that there's no misunderstanding there, the Finnish citizen who chooses Czech as their first language, they must choose English as a second language. Because again, the country of your origin, your passport, does not matter as much as the language that you choose first and second, but either of these could be English. And that has a bit of gimmick to it because you might want to think about which language do I choose for my case study or for the abstract global numerical reasoning and all the rest. And there are some nuances there. When we get to the different components, the different exams that this exam or this competition comprises, we will see which language is being used for each. And as a general rule, our general advice in this context is always, if you are a polyglot, if you speak multiple languages, think carefully which one you want to choose, in which you can express yourself in writing well, in which you can write in a sophisticated manner, in a clear manner, or perhaps that you know the names of various conventions or institutions in that particular language. So there is a bit of thinking behind, do I need to process information in a language, or do I need to express myself in writing in that particular language? What language might be an interview, which is not part of the selection procedure we're covering today. Later, it will be an actual job interview. That's a separate story. So in your profile, you might want to list all the languages that you are able to speak or express yourself in, because that gives information at a later stage. But for the purposes of language 1, language 2, you want to look at, okay, do I speak pretty good, say, English and French? That might inform you which one you're going to choose for which language 1 or language 2. Qualifications. Qualifications is always a tricky thing, and there are just so many variables. There are so many possible career paths and studies and personal backgrounds. So that is difficult to put that in a system, yet obviously it's a specialist competition. So EPSO did try to put out these compulsory options and scenarios, and you need to fit in one of those. So one of them is that if you have a bachelor degree, so essentially a 3-year university diploma, it needs to be in law, in economics, in engineering, transport, logistics, or political science. So this is an exhaustive list, right? So if you are a history major or you have a bachelor in linguistics, that is not going to qualify in this particular bracket. So it needs to be in one of these domains, because in this case, you need to have at least 7 years of relevant professional experience. And the word relevant is really relevant because it needs to be related to the kind of tasks and the kind of job description that they put out there that you're going to be dealing with. Otherwise, it's not considered relevant. So if I was running a restaurant, that would not be relevant, even if it includes a lot of logistics and a lot of transport of various items, but it's not going to be considered relevant. Scenario or option number 2 is if you have 4 years of university diploma, whether that's a master's or even goes further to PhD or equivalent, in the fields mentioned above, right? The same fields that were mentioned in the previous bracket. So economics, engineering, law, transport, logistics, or political science. In that case, you need to have at least 6 years of relevant professional experience, right? So again, it's a somewhat fairly straightforward thing. But then again, if you obtain your degree outside of the EU, do you need to do an equivalence of that? Or does it really correspond to another field? There are quite a few variables up there. And I see from the corner of my eye, does urban planning go under engineering? I cannot tell you, right? Even if I could, that I think it does belong under there, that wouldn't be relevant. So that's a kind of question that you want to ask the selection board. So selection board is basically a small group of individuals who are responsible, legally speaking, independent of EPSO, but they are under, let's say, the administrative umbrella of EPSO, but they are independently the ones who are responsible for a particular competition. And then you basically send a message through the EPSO contact form, by no means, even if you know who these individuals are, by no means through LinkedIn or personally, but through formal channels. And you can ask, okay, does this qualify? Does it fit in there? And generally, they can guide you. They can give you their position. But in some cases, they might say, well, this needs to be judged on a case-by-case basis. So if you think it broadly fits, go into the competition, and then at the eligibility check, there is some risk that they may say no. And again, I know it's not an ideal scenario, but then again, I'm not going to be able to decide or say anything, especially not something that would have any legal value to say this or that particular field does qualify or does not qualify. So that's let's say the most straightforward course of action is that you contact them and get a formal position from them. And then scenario number 3 is that if you have 3-year university diploma in other fields, right, like basically anything, that's the linguistic and that's the French history studies, and that's the what have you, I don't know, studies in migration studies. Anything would fall under this heading, but in this case, you need to have at least 9 years of professional experience. And then there's actually one more scenario for those of you who may have a PhD relevant to the transport area, because then there is some exception given for that. So even if you have any other underlying degree, but you have a PhD in a related area, then there is some flexibility in there for you. So all of this is certainly presented in the notice of competition, but I understand that there's quite a bit of variability there. So there are a lot of individual situations. And if you are doubtful or it's somewhat of a gray zone, then be sure to ask for the official position. And then the professional experience, what does it mean? It's relevant. I mentioned how relevant is relevant, how important it is that you have acquired your professional experience in a relevant field. Well, it must have been acquired in one or more of the areas listed in the notice of competition. And you really have a quite range and a broad list, a long list of different options in there. So and it needs to be related to one or more of the activities. So areas and activities, and it's under point 3.3. So absolutely looked up if it's not absolutely straightforward, right? Like it could be just one, for the sake of example, it could be about trans-European networks and military mobility. And it could be implementing, monitoring, evaluating policies, right? So enforcement of transport rules. But let's say if you spent many number of years in a national ministry of transport or ministry of mobility, or you were responsible for sustainable urban transport or anything along those lines, well, there is no true question that your work experience would be considered relevant. So it does give you guidance because, again, transport is a niche area to some degree, and it's a specialist competition. But as you all know, this really includes a very broad range of topics and policies and areas that the candidates can absolutely fit into. Let me pause here for a second before talking about the opportunities. And I just got these 2 questions that I'm going to answer. So one is, I'm not sure if I'm eligible. I'm not sure I have enough relevant experience. Can I apply anyway? Will I be able to do all the tests? And the answer is yes. So that's what I briefly hinted at, where you can absolutely apply, because if you fulfill all the basic criteria that you're an EU citizen. Let's say if you are a Vietnamese citizen, you're not going to be able to qualify, or even a British citizen for that matter, because you need to have the passport of one of the 27 member states. There's no question about that. When it comes to experience, suppose you do have 6 years or 7 years or 9 years of experience, and you're a bit hesitant whether or not that's relevant, you can still go through the entire process. And if you succeed, the selection board will actually check your eligibility. So we'll talk about it in a second, but they will check and make sure that you are eligible or not at the end, right? So you will be given the opportunity to sit all these tests and book your test date, sit the test, and then even succeed. And only then will they check the eligibility, which again is good or bad, because you may not know for 100% certainty that you're eligible. But then again, at least you can go through the process without being excluded early on. And then number 2 are unpaid internship or internship in transport that covers some costs considered as relevant professional experience? Well, generally, the principle that EPSO has been communicating is that the work experience needs to be remunerated. So you need to have been paid for a given work to be considered as work experience. So volunteering typically does not fall under that, or an unpaid internship would typically not fall under that. And I use the word typically because I can imagine that in some cases there are exceptions. So who knows, maybe you were seconded somewhere or sent into a certain position pro bono, but it was still a formal position and you did serious work in that field. It often matters if you can prove it with the right documentation that you have some contract or some employment sheet or anything formal and official that you can prove, again, without knowing any further details about your background. So I'm not saying that it's a very rigid rule, but that, again, that's the broad principle that they operate on. Typically, this refers to internship as part of your studies, right? If you are still in a master's program and part of that requires you to have spent 3 months in a company or somewhere, then it's probably not considered as part of the overall calculation of work experience. But then again, if it's something done after your studies have finished, then there's more room for that kind of evaluation. So why is it a good opportunity? For most of you, I don't need to sell the idea that this is a good stuff, that working for the EU has wonderful benefits and a very attractive job and career prospect. One is the health insurance, European schools, and absolutely not negligible the very attractive salaries that the institutions offer to officials, to civil servants, and especially for administrators, and especially on AD7 level, right? So this is AD7, and those of you who may not be familiar with, the entry level is AD5. So those recruits who have university degrees, typically master's degrees, but no work experience, can start at 85 level. It doesn't mean that if you have work experience, you could not start at 85. Absolutely, you can still be hired even if you have many years of work experience. It all depends on the competition, the EPSO competition, based on which you are placed on the reserve list. And in this case, this is an AD7, which typically, at the minimum, would require 6 years of experience, work experience. Now, we saw the many variations depending on your academic background, depending on your work experience. Is it relevant? I mean, the background, is it relevant or not relevant or related to the job profile? But in any case, the hiring grade is AD7. And we have a little salary calculator on EU training. So you're welcome to check that out, play around with different variables. And again, it gives you an indication. It's not the official, but it's definitely based on official numbers. And the first is, are you based in Brussels, or would you have been based, I don't know if that's how you say that, in Brussels at the time of recruitment? So when they hire you, have you been living in Brussels or a certain distance in the radius around Brussels for less than 6 months or more than 6 months? And if you are basically hired from outside Brussels because you haven't been living here, then you're also entitled to what they call the expatriation allowance. So that gives more. We didn't include that. So it's the net salary, the rough estimate is 6,300 euros. And then add on top of that if you are hired from outside Brussels because you haven't lived here at the moment of the recruitment. Now, let's actually look at the competition. Let's look at what it means, what are the different phases, and what kind of exams you can expect. Application process. So the application, you can submit that in the 24 official languages. It's pretty straightforward. It's done online, all good, quite smooth sailing. The next thing is that you need to upload supporting documents, which here is really important because of the background qualification, your degree, your diploma, and the work experience, whatever ways you can prove that you have acquired the right time, the right amount of work experience, and that it's relevant to the job. And this might take a little time for you to get hold of these kind of documents and these kind of background information. So if you need to contact a long forgotten employer, or you need to contact the university where you studied, and you barely remember the country it was in. So all of this, you want to go ahead and do that already now, because EPSO gives you some flexibility in terms of deadline to upload these supporting documents. So it's not the same as the application deadline, but it's still not unlimited. So the application deadline is 7th of November. So pretty much 1 month and 1 day from today. So roughly 4 weeks. And the uploading of the document that needs to happen by the 12th of December, right? So you have roughly 2 months, a little over 2 months to do that. And as I said before, it might take a bit of time. If it's not in any of the 24 official languages of the EU, you might need to get hold of an official translation. So there is a bit of bureaucracy involved. Perhaps more importantly and most relevantly, let's look at the actual tests that you need to sit. So what are these tests? Well, there's certainly a computer-based test. Well, all of them are computer-based ultimately, but typically the way we refer to these is the CBT, computer-based test, the abstract verbal numerical reasoning skills, so-called psychometric tests. The second one is field-related multiple choice quiz. And that's really important because it's, as the name suggests, about transport policy at large. So really broad in the context of the notice of competition and all the fields that the notice of competition deals with. And this is done in a multiple choice quiz format. So you will be given a series of questions and a series of answer options, and you need to pick the right answer. And then there's a case study. We're going to go through each of these in a nutshell. I'm happy to give you more information about these, but we also have a wealth of materials out there. So we do seminars, webinars, recordings, handouts, sample tests. All of that is available on our website. So if you want to practice whichever field you feel you need more focus on, we're happy to offer the right service to help you prepare. But having said that, one important aspect is that all these tests will be online. All these tests will be remotely proctored. So that basically means that you need to download a certain app on your computer, or a computer that you get hold of if you have a corporate laptop where you cannot install some app. And the exam itself will happen on the same day for all candidates. It doesn't mean it happens at the same time, but there's a 24-hour time frame where you can book your test. So if you happen to be in a different time zone, or you're just an early riser and you really want to do that at 2 a.m., you can do that. But the bottom line is it's a 24-hour window for all candidates. And this is how I presume they try to minimize sharing of information or other stuff, but also to streamline the actual administration of the tests. Now, I need to say it at this point that based on the experience so far that other candidates have had with this remotely proctored tests, and there was for IP competition and economist competition just happened, it's not been great. So that the company that EPSO actually got as their contractor has not been very solid in their delivery of these tests. So the IT infrastructure around it has not been as robust as it could or should have been. Now, having said that, we're hoping that this is going to be fixed, because it has really created a lot of frustration for candidates, and presumably EPSO alike, because they want to be sure that candidates have a good experience, even if it's a pretty challenging to sit these tests and go through all of that. Certainly, it's in everyone's interest that this goes smoothly and this goes without any technical hiccups. So I just wanted to say that, because you may hear rumors or you may see in various social media channels that many candidates were kind of upset when the system was freezing or bugging, or they had to restart certain systems. And then, what are these computer-based tests? What we call CBT, the abstract verbal numerical reasoning. These can be done in any of the 24 official languages except English, right? So it's a pretty interesting thing that I'm even thinking about a strange scenario where you were told, right, that the language part that we discussed earlier, where you can basically pick any of the 24 official languages for language 1 and language 2, but one of them has to be English. But then again, could you even play around with how you do the linguistic allocation, where the way you choose languages will really fit your personal profile and background and linguistic knowledge to maximize your potential. But in any case, what happens here, you need to sit this test in any of the 24 but English. For that matter, you really can choose whatever language there may be. And these abstract verbal numerical reasoning will be administered in those languages. Where it truly matters is the verbal reasoning, because that's where you need to analyze and understand and make logical deductions based on that text. Importantly, these 3 tests, these reasoning skill tests, it's only on a pass or fail basis. So, and I'm using air quotes, you only need to pass that. But usually, given the number of candidates and also in proportion to the number of places on the reserve list, this can still get tricky. So it's not a hurdle that you want to fail. It's something that absolutely needs to be done, because the true test that comes afterwards, as we're going to see in a moment, the multiple choice quiz related to the field of the competition. This one doesn't count towards your final score. So once you pass over this, you're done. Common question here is, are you going to know at the moment you're sitting these exams whether you pass these or not? And the answer is no, you're not going to know in that moment. You need to do all the tests that are part of the competition package, because there could be issues later on where they might spot a certain question that just wasn't validated, or didn't, for any reason, may have to be, I think, expunged. That's the technical term, that need to be removed from the batch of questions, and that would change the score for everyone. Meaning you're not going to know right then and there when you're sitting the exam whether you passed or not. You need to go through the whole process. So verbal, abstract, numerical reasoning, just 1 word on these, and I will not spend any more time. We have lots of free and some premium webinars on our website on methodology, on best practices, on a couple of ideas on how you can make the most of it, because all of these have a certain method to it. So verbal reasoning, the time allocated for this and the number of questions, fairly classic, fairly standard. So 20 questions and 35 minutes. And the kind of question there is, this is not a linguistic test. This is not an understanding, a comprehension, a language comprehension test. This is a logical reasoning test. So there are texts, and you need to make certain logical operations and deductions, and then find the correct answer. Excuse me. Numerical reasoning, again, fairly standard in terms of the time and the number of questions. You have 10 questions in 20 minutes. So you do your first numerical reasoning, that is 2 minutes per question, which is pretty good and feasible, as long as you have trained those mental muscles beforehand, that you can quickly do certain operations and mathematical operations, basic ones, with percentages, with some decimals and things like that. You need to be in that mindset to be able to really pass this one. But again, it's absolutely feasible to do. And then comes the abstract reasoning, which is 10 questions in 10 minutes. That tends to be the more tricky one, because it's 1 minute per question. And the abstract reasoning is really kind of cryptic for most people. But again, it's feasible. And especially if we look at the scoring, it's pass or fail, but there is even more addition to it, or makes it slightly easier for most candidates, is that the numerical and the abstract reasoning, there's a combined pass mark. So they will look at these two as a combined pass mark. So as long as you get 10 points out of 20, you're good. You're not competing against others in this particular exam. So even if you mess up numerical, but then get all 10 abstract reasoning done and accurate and correct, you can still pass. And then for the verbal reasoning, it's 10 out of 20. So that's pretty clear. Now, assuming you passed this particular step, that's when your score would be looked at for the next one, which is a field-related multiple choice quiz, 30 minutes, 40 questions. So 40 questions, and then the pass mark is 20 out of 30. Now, the pass mark itself is important and needs to be reached, but it's insufficient because there's a ranking element, as we'll see in a moment. But so 20 out of 30, you need to get that as a minimum score. And in 30 minutes, 40 questions, again, pretty tight deadline, and you really need to know your stuff. Need to know, broadly speaking, anything that the notice of competition mentions as the broad scope of this particular competition, and most notably the transport policy areas. And it's in English, so that's a really interesting one. It's in English, right? So it's in English, and I see a couple of questions coming in. So I'm asking my colleagues to double check that because I don't want to say anything that might be off. So let's just double check it to be absolutely sure. But to the best of my knowledge, that's how it goes. But let's be absolutely sure. And then again, if there is any mismatch between what I'm telling you and the notice of competition, always the notice of competition that prevails. And most importantly, as mentioned earlier, you must be among the highest scoring. And yes, I see that. Okay, so it's 40 minutes and 30 questions. Okay, we're definitely gonna change that in the slide as we share it afterwards. So our apologies, because that's an important thing to bear in mind. So 40 minutes and 30 questions. So it's actually reversed. But even so, okay, you don't have, well, actually have a little more than a minute and not less than a minute, but it's still a pretty tight thing of roughly a minute per question. So you cannot so much think about any particular question. You really need to be pretty familiar with all stuff around this particular topic and this particular policy area. And then the scoring, right? So there's a ranking there among candidates. So candidates will be ranked based on their scoring. And since, as we said before, so there are 30 questions and 40 minutes. So the 30 question is not that you need to have at least 20 points. Great. But you may need to even have 25, 26, depending on how other candidates perform. So there is this relative scoring, and they see how many answers certain candidates got right, and then they will rank you on that basis, right? So just to be absolutely sure, 30 questions in 40 minutes, and then the pass mark is 20. But then again, given the ranking approach, even the 20 is basically quite irrelevant because other candidates will likely score far, far higher. Now, having said that, if you pass this second step, then your case study is going to be scored, right? So this case study is going to be scored. What is the case study? We put there most likely because this has not yet been communicated, whether it's actually going to be 45 minutes, but the competitions we've been seeing since the summer has been or has had 45 minutes. The way EPSO has run these competitions since this so-called new system has been in place is that they would release a background document for the case study 2 weeks before the exam date. So what is the exam date? We don't yet know. We know that it's the 7th of November, which is the application deadline. So presumably it's going to be, again, I would guess either mid-December or more likely early January, because they need to give enough time for booking, because you need to book that particular hour or that particular slot. I think it goes in 30-minute increments during the day for your exam day after the deadline has passed for applying. And then you book your exam time slot, basically, on the same day, and there you sit the exam. But then again, compared to the exam date, minus 2 weeks, so 2 weeks ahead, they released a background file. Now, is that related to transport? It may as well be, or it may absolutely not be, because it's not testing your knowledge in the field. This is not a knowledge test. What the case study tests is your communication skills. And it's not even testing other competencies at all. only communication skills. So the background file could be, it's usually framed in a commission or an EU context, occasionally referring to made up or imagined countries or places and individuals. But again, it's kind of rooted in reality. And then they give you an assignment, a certain task that you need to do at the and write about in the exam. And sometimes it's a report, sometimes it's more analytical, like present a certain issue in the context of that case study. And the case study is available during the exam. But since it's a 25 page document with all sorts of background information, you need to have processed and analyzed that particular case study before the exam to be able to effectively answer the question that you're going to be given. So you cannot process that information in 45 minutes and write the proper answers or the proper response. So that's typically how it's been done, and more than likely this is how it's going to be in this particular competition as well. But we don't know whether it's really going to be 45 minutes. Most likely yes, but we'll see that soon enough. And then the scoring, that's 10 points in total, and you need to have a pass mark of at least 5. And interestingly, this can be done in any of the EU's official languages. But then there's this strange sentence that we found for the first time in a notice of competition, which says EPSO strongly recommends English, and it's not a language test. But again, strongly recommends, I think, again, this is my speculation, but it's probably about, hey, if you put it in English, we have far more people who can actually evaluate this case study, because most people at the commission would be perfectly comfortable in English, and they can be taken as evaluators. But legally speaking, you have the right to write that in other languages as well. So if you write it in Maltese or write that in Slovak, absolutely can do that. But again, on their side, it might trigger certain logistical challenges on the other side. But again, legally speaking, this runs in any of the EU's official languages. One important point to already think about the logistical part of this, well, you are very much into logistics, most of you, but the logistical part of this is to think about the keyboard that you're going to use. So what kind of computer are you used to? AZERTY, QWERTY, or if you are Spanish, then you have certain characters, and if you're Polish, you have even more. So make sure that you're using a computer with the right keyboard and letters, because if you write that in one particular language, then you need to be able to type fast and not to be used to a totally different layout and lose time. Okay, now this is a pass-fail test. You need to reach at least 5 points, and that's quite straightforward. This is not ranked. So the ranking only happens on the basis of the knowledge-based multiple choice quiz. Okay, with those 30 multiple choice quiz questions. So with that, if that is done and that is all properly assessed and scored based on the multiple choice quiz result, meaning you passed that and you were among the best, the highest ranked candidates, and you passed this one as well, wonderful. That's when you are going to be on the reserve list almost. Why almost? Because there's still an eligibility check. So they are going to check whether you have the right background, the right qualifications, the right stuff that you had declared at the beginning. And then there's this kind of calculation that until not more than 1.5 of the successful candidates, so that's 80, 1.5, so it's basically 120 candidates that they reach, and then they basically look at the eligibility and background documents and then the case study, and then determine who those 120 are going to be. And certainly what you declared and what your documents can prove. And that is why it's important that you hand in information that really backs up your claims and makes a case for a certain experience or a certain professional profile. Then comes the reserve list. You are notified in your EPSO account. You put the champagne into the fridge. You don't need to open it because you are still into the recruitment part, where you need to find an actual vacancy to be hired, most likely in DG Move. And for good reason, they are the ones who are initiating this particular competition, because absolutely they need new staff. So they are the ones who are going to be looking at those reserve lists and then try to, well, if one does not drink champagne, you can put in a great organic apple juice, just as good, whatever you want to celebrate with. But my point is that you need to hold off for a moment, a little longer, because the recruitment step still needs to happen. So we are actually happy to help you in that phase as well, because we have our coaches who prepare you for interviews. I did a webinar some time ago, I might redo it at one point, on how to get a job once you are on the reserve list. So there are certain good techniques where you want to present your motivation letter, your CV, your background, and optimize your chances of actually getting hired based on the reserve list. And then may involve further assessments, interviews. That's a big question mark and a little gray zone in the entire process, because the hiring institutions, whether it's DG Move or perhaps some other, they could still have you for an interview, or they might say something else, in the sense that, hey, we want to test those 10 very competent candidates and to see who's the most suitable for this particular job profile. Or they just look at the reserve list and say, okay, you are hired, or at least we extend the job offer to you, which you presumably will accept. So in that part, they still have a bit of flexibility, or a bit of possibility to add certain interviews or so. But then again, given the number of candidates, this is probably not going to be anything even near comparable to what the actual selection procedure requires you to do. Voila, how to get the job. And I know that there are a couple of questions coming in, and then we will look at those. So getting the job, well, practicing and preparing and having a system and a methodology in place. So it's I always compare this to sports competition, where you can start jogging every evening, but if you're preparing for a marathon, well, then you need to have a certain method, a preparation system, and time allocated, and aligning certain things to succeed. So if you do this, take it seriously, and then have a plan in place. And then being persistent, and you might want to certainly do simulations, but also create a study group, or with peers, with colleagues, with others who prepare for this, where you can motivate each other, where you can share certain ideas that you have. And absolutely, we're happy to help you and happy to provide all the materials. We have verbal reasoning in all 24 languages, numerical, abstract, and case study. We're just rolling out even more case study services and products in the coming weeks. And we are absolutely here to help you with the coaches, with our trainers. And I know that there are a couple of questions, but I'd like to put up a discount code, which we have for you for 2 days, hoping you're able to take advantage of those. But again, a couple of lists on what other services we have. You can certainly look at those and look them up on our site. A new version of my book, the Ultimate EU Test Book, is coming in a couple of months, hopefully before the end of the year, with this nice purple cover page. And there's a Facebook group dedicated to this particular competition that you might want to look at. And I think, yes, Rita was kind enough to put the discount code into the corner while I spend the next few minutes answering some questions that came in. And here's one: do wrong answers penalize the final score? The answer is no. So if you have the wrong answer for the verbal reasoning or for other tests, it does not deduct any points from your final score. So that's probably good news. Here's another one. So for the multiple choice quiz, will EPSO release some indication of the topic? I'm assuming you're asking about the sources, or what sort of topics, or how that's going to be covered, because for the economists was very theoretical, university level questions, and it would be good to know what they expect in a broad field such as transport, since applicants can be engineers as well as political science. And I cannot give you any formal answer for that, because I'm first of all, I've never been told by EPSO, but we can definitely rely on our own 15 or more years of experience in the field, not of transport, but of following EPSO exams, and certainly the notice of competition and our general understanding of how they test candidates. And the answer is that they are looking for the policy perspective, right? You're going to be an EU official, you're going to be a civil servant, you're going to be dealing with these topics, and they cannot distinguish. There are no sub-profiles for those with an engineering background versus those with a legal background. So they're not going to ask questions which are very unique to the engineers, but all the lawyers would tear their hair out, and vice versa, where they might ask something extremely legal, but the engineers may not be expected to know. Having said that, there are going to be certain legal aspects of an international convention. What regulates a certain area when it comes to road transport? What are the general principles around, I don't know, the security of aviation or military logistics? So there are all these topics which are in the notice of competition are subject to be asked in the multiple choice quiz. And we ourselves, we were trying to tailor our own specific practice questions that is made available on the website on the basis of these topics, right? So on the basis of what the Commission has initiated, what Parliament reports have been drafted, what sort of, what is the kind of the corpus, the general knowledge in this particular field. So we try to encompass that among the dedicated multiple choice questions that we are offering on our website. So I hope this answers your question to some degree. Of course, I know it's still, I mean, it's a specialist exam, but it's still a very large area of policy, of generally as a general knowledge. But definitely look at what DG Move does. That's absolutely essential, because you might want to look at their annual report. You want to look at the key initiatives they have had, perhaps even history, not in the sense of let's say 50, 60 years ago, how a certain thing was handled, but what a broader context of certain policy areas or subsections of the transport area. How is that viewed in the context of the EU institutions and of EU policymaking? So look at those. There are certain fact sheets. There are certain resources that you can tap into, and hopefully that covers by and large the topics that they will ask. The fact that they are asking you and they are ranking the candidates on the basis of this multiple choice quiz, that makes it quite tricky, because 30 questions is not that many. And ranking candidates on that basis might mean that the questions themselves are going to be quite tough. So again, that's my hunch, given the sheer nature of how the scoring goes. But again, if certain areas nobody actually knows, or it's so nuanced that it's very hard to decode, then it's very hard to decode for others as well. Next question has disappeared. Okay, good. Here's another question. What is the content of the practice exams based on? Has it been confirmed by EPSO, or it's a best estimate? In all transparency, it's the best estimate. So we are not in touch with EPSO, and obviously they would never tell us anything other than they tell the candidates by and large. And especially, and it's not even EPSO, I believe, but it's a selection board, which again, legally speaking, is independent of EPSO and presumably has members from DG Move or anyone in this particular policy area. So they would be putting together the body of the pool of questions that they're going to use at the exam. And again, we, based on everything that we know about the system, about the policy, about the EU, we would try to pinpoint and simulate those questions to help you understand the kind of topics that you are well advised to revise. All right, what else do I have? Not many more. Could you please explain how to prove that work experience is related to, or how to prove, I believe, how to prove that work experience related to transport? Well, again, I haven't checked the actual EPSO, the current application form, and they might ask you about that. But if you get a certain work certificate or description of the duties that you had to do while working in a certain position, you might highlight certain points, or you might say, okay, this was actually 80% of my job, and that was very relevant to transport in particular. So again, proving, yes, we want to provide all the background information and this kind of certificates and other proof points. and then say that, yes, this I strongly believe is relevant, and ultimately it's the selection board that's going to evaluate that. I see that there's a question on how long is the reserve list valid. Typically it's 1 year, but for specialist competitions that tends to be more flexible. So it tends to be either possible to extend that beyond 1 year. A few years ago, the principle was it's valid until the same domain or the competition in the same field is announced, which might happen 3 or 4 years later. Now, certainly, it's in the institution's best interest to hire the new staff from the reserve list. So there is a certain interest on keeping that open and valid as long as there are candidates on it. So again, the general rule is 1 year, but I can easily imagine that this will be longer as long as there are valid and interested and qualified candidates on the list who have not yet been hired. Voila, I think our time is up. Very much appreciate you being here. Thank you for listening to this webinar. I hope it was useful. I hope it gave you a clear idea of what to expect, what are the different steps, how the exam is going to go. And we are absolutely keen to hear from you. So trying to be helpful. If you need some resource or something that you think would be helpful for your preparation, let us know. The same goes for our transport policy multiple choice quiz, that if you spot anything, we'll do rigorous quality check. We want to be sure that we are providing you the most accurate and the most comprehensive information. So with that, a big thanks to Rita, a big thanks to Zsófi, a big thanks to Agi, a big thanks to everyone in the team who helped make today's webinar happen. And reach out to us, wishing you good luck, become transport expert, become transport policy staff in the Commission in a couple of months. And if you succeed, and when you succeed, let us know. We'll be very happy to have been contributing to your success. All right, good luck, and hope to see you soon.